My friends, the Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus set out with his disciples for the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Along the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They said in reply, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." But he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter said to him in reply, "You are the Christ." Then he warned them not to tell anyone about him. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer greatly and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed and rise after 3 days. He spoke this openly. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. At this, he turned around and, looking at his disciples, rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do." He summoned the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and that of the gospel will save it." The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord.
The themes of suffering, saving, and losing lives seem tailor-made for the events that have transpired this past week, including the destruction of so much life and property down in the south due to Hurricane Florence, bringing death and pain and ruin to many, many people. We have much to pray for because they are not out of the woods probably for the next few days or maybe even weeks. I also think of last Tuesday, which marked the 17th anniversary of the terrorist attacks in our country on 9/11. There were many tributes and services around the country, as you may know, honoring the lives of the innocent victims lost that fateful day. And you know, almost 3,000 people died that day back in 2001. The area of the World Trade Center in New York City, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and in the 4 planes that were hijacked by the terrorists, including Flight 93, which you may recall crashed in a field near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Supposedly it was on its way to destroying the Capitol building in Washington. Just a few days ago, I read a news article that focused on the many more thousands who have suffered and died from cancer since then due to the collapse of the 2 towers in New York City. So many people were exposed to flying particles of concrete and glass and asbestos, among other toxins. And you know, an estimated 10,000 people either died or became ill as a result of that fallout. A lot of times we forget about that. Now, most of us may recall where we were and what we were doing that fateful morning of 9/11. I recall being in my very first parish assignment as a priest in Good Shepherd Church in Henrietta, right by Rochester, when one of my staff came into my office and told me that a plane had just crashed in one of the towers at the Trade Center. And several of us went up to the rectory living room to see the TV news, only to view in horror the second plane hitting the other tower. And it was a very surreal moment, especially more challenging for me as a young priest, since my pastor had left a couple of months earlier to go on a 6-month sabbatical. And thus the weight of pastoral care during that horrible week and afterwards fell on my young shoulders. And to say the least, I was emotionally spent with lots of tears in the process. Yet, when I think of the positive spin in today's gospel that Jesus puts on his having to suffer only to rise again, and how those who are willing to lose their lives for his sake and the sake of others will save it, I think of all the sacrifices that so many made to help other people during that extremely painful time in our nation's history. And some call it the worst day in our nation's history. For example, I think of the passengers on Flight 93 who fought before terrorists on board in the hopes of regaining the plane to prevent them from hitting whatever their target was. And sadly, all 44 people on board died in the plane crash, but the passengers' heroic efforts and sacrifice kept more innocent lives from being taken. And I also think of the firefighters and medical personnel and police officers who were on the scene there at Ground Zero, at the base of the towers, to help the wounded, to put out the fires, to guide others out of that chaotic mess that morning. And many of them, of course, died in the process, especially when the towers collapsed. I think of Father Michael Judge, the priest who was on the scene there to comfort the afflicted and to offer prayers and anointings to the dying, only to be killed instantly when a piece of building fell on him. And there are so many more examples of such heroic efforts of people not thinking about their own safety and comfort, but reaching out through the dark chaos of that moment with the loving, caring hands of Christ to give people hope and let the suffering know that they're not alone in what they're going through. And that's basically the message that Jesus is teaching Peter and the other apostles and all of us this morning in this gospel scene. Our Lord is making it very clear that if we want to be his disciples, then we have to be willing to get our hands dirty and stretch ourselves beyond what we think we're capable of giving. And even at times place ourselves in uncomfortable or even harmful situations so that we can be the great lights of hope and love that God intends all of us to be in our very dark and troubled world. Peter did not understand that in this gospel scene. And he even tries to prevent Jesus from going through with what he thinks is a foolhardy decision, tantamount to suicide in his mind, for Jesus to just go off to Jerusalem, suffer, and die. Peter doesn't want to buy into that. His mindset is in other, more pleasant-sounding options, like having Jesus rule over Israel and kick out the Romans from their land. And you know, Jesus promptly rebukes Peter for this very mistaken notion. I think Peter is very relatable to you and I in what he does here. Because we all have at times ideas of what we may think are better ways to go in life. Sometimes even think we know better than what Jesus is teaching here. Many people today reduce the gospel either to be something that is supposed to just make us feel good, or to reject parts of his message that just don't fit into our plans, or would cause too much inconvenience for us to change, especially if we're embracing sinful behaviors or lifestyles. Quite often in our world today, people reduce the purpose of living to this: experiencing as much pleasure as we can while we're alive. Well, that's hedonism. That's not Christianity. Suffering and sorrow are part of our human lives, whether we want it or not. And we certainly try to avoid unnecessary suffering and sorrow by hopefully making good decisions that will strengthen and enrich our lives, not destroy them or hurt the lives of others around us. And yet, you know what? The measure of true love for God and other people is found in how much we're willing to give of ourselves for the benefit of others. So the key to our faith is how we respond to the suffering going on around us. For however we treat another person is how we're treating Jesus himself. So whenever a difficult or tragic situation arises, whether it's a hurricane, a flood, a violent attack, or an illness, well, God calls us to rise above those situations and even turn bad things into greater goods, just as Jesus turned his Good Friday torment into Easter Sunday joy. Yes, it's healthy to acknowledge feelings of anger, or sadness, or pain, or disappointment when bad things happen in our lives, but don't dwell on them. Jesus calls us to rechannel such negativity into something more positive and life-giving, to do more constructive, hopeful things, not act out in bitter, destructive ways. And someday, hopefully, God will show us how all of this good and bad works together, somehow for the greater glory of God. In the meantime, we just have to accept it all as part of a package that we call the mystery of faith. I'll leave you with a little analogy that a friend of mine sent me a while ago via email, which was intended to teach kids about how to see good and bad working together in life. Yet it's an analogy that certainly speaks to us adults as well. The story concerns a teenage girl who went to her mom one day and complained about all that seems to be going wrong for her lately. She's failing algebra, her boyfriend broke up with her, her best friend is moving away. Why is God doing this to me, she wondered. And while the daughter listed her complaints, her mother listened patiently as she continued her work on baking a cake in the kitchen. So she asked her daughter if she would like to have a snack to lift her spirits a bit. And the daughter replied, "Sure, Mom, I love your cake." And the mother said, "Good, then have some of this cooking oil to snack on." And the daughter frowned and said, "What? Yuck, Mom, no." "Then how about a couple of these raw eggs?" "That's gross, Mom," said the daughter. "Well, would you like some flour then? Or maybe how about some of this baking soda?" "Mom, those are all yucky." Then the mother said this, "Yes, all of those things seem bad in themselves, but when they are put together the right way, they make a wonderful, delicious cake. And God works the same way. Many times we wonder why God would let us go through such bad and difficult times, yet God knows that when all of these things are put in proper order, they all ultimately work for God's glory. We just have to trust that eventually God is making something wonderful using all of these things." Good for you, Mom. So how do you handle difficult situations and times? And how much are you willing to give up out of the love for Jesus you claim to have? Always remember that the road of life that God gives us is not meant to be a pleasure cruise, but a tough turnpike, on which we have to be willing to pay the tolls required for heaven, just as Jesus paid the ultimate toll for us, out of love for us on the cross. And the tolls for us are these: keep God's commandments, sacrifice for others with a load of love.